And thanks for staying with us here on the Joy News channel. As I indicated earlier, we're having a conversation around the International Women's Day celebration. My guest helping us to do the conversation for tonight, we have Dr. Angela Lusigi, UNDP resident coordinator here in Ghana. And we also have Dr. Zaneto Ajiman-Rawlings, who are all helping us to do the discussion. Thank you, ladies, for joining us.
Thank you.
And so I'm the only man around the table now. There's no table here, but figuratively, we know that the needs of women must be prioritized, as the reports we are getting is indicating. But Dr. Lusigi, let me start off with you. We know that additionally, we need some 360 billion United States dollars to close the gender gap and to put to the fore the concerns and the needs of women globally. Why do you feel, first of all, that there's a challenge for the international community in getting all of these hurdles out of the way?
Thank you very much, Blessed. That's an interesting question. But before we look at why there's a challenge in getting those resources, we need to have an understanding about why we need to have those resources. So 2023 was a halfway point to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the whole world is not doing well when it comes to gender equality. And Ghana is, of course, one of the countries. But the important thing about investing in gender equality is that it's the pathway to achieving all the other Sustainable Development Goals. So everything that we do about reducing disparities when it comes to health and education, it comes to the workplace and the economy, goes a long way into the achievement of the different goals. So for us as UNDP and the development world in general, we see the resources that we invest in gender equality as being the accelerator of achieving all the other development goals. So while there is a challenge with generating resources now for development in general, prioritizing investments in gender equality will really help us to accelerate our way forward.
And speaking within the same context of the SDGs, we're just 7 plus or minus years away from achieving the target. Can we really raise this amount of money?
And this is why I talked about acceleration. Because when you look at the amount of money that you've mentioned targeting gender equality, actually investing that money will also help you achieve the other goals. So definitely in a resource-constrained environment where we need to prioritize the allocation of our resources, I believe that investing that amount of money will take us much further ahead when it comes to, for example, growing our economies. Because we know, and this is a fact, that countries that are growing at a certain level with disparities are slower in reducing poverty than countries with slower disparities. So addressing these disparities will accelerate our progress.
But Dr. Rawlings, I don't think it's all about funding, is it? There's the aspect about policy as well. And fortunately, you are a member of parliament, so you're able to speak to that. How crucial is it for us to try and rally all members of parliament to try and pass bills, laws that will, inure to the benefit of women?
Thank you. I believe that to start with, as a society, we're not gender sensitive enough. But I'm going to leave gender aside and say women sensitive, because the risk that one runs with using the term gender is it's not just with regards to the role of women and everything. So I'll specify with women. We have 40 women in Parliament out of 275 members of Parliament, 20 on either side for now. None of them got in there on a quota system. Every woman got in there fighting harder, if I may say so, than the men in a way, because the odds are against you as a woman when it comes to politics. And yes, policy is huge. The Constitution vests a lot of power in the presidency. So in the executive, in the presidency. So if you have the executive taking a keen interest in advancing the cause of women, the equality, the equity, the access to resources, restoring that balance that should be there, then you see a lot more happening, because the House of Parliament is basically for passing laws. Policy emanates from the executive. And so we can't come up with that. We have to work with what we're given. And if you see what's happening in Parliament with regards to about 14% representation of women, not special seats, no quota system, we have to go one step behind because we have the affirmative action, which is now before Parliament. But if you're putting in place a system that says you need to have at least 30%, it should be 50%, but at least 30% representation of women in Parliament, and you don't have political party reforms, it won't translate into the representation that you're looking for in the House. And so we seem to be jumping ahead of ourselves when there are little steps that we need to take that would lead to exactly where we want to be.
But what's the argument? Is it the case that 40 is not enough? 40 MPs, private members'
here's the thing.
Tolerated.
Here's the thing. We're in a country where women are more than 50%. If you're to look at Parliament and ask yourself, is it representational? Is it proportionally representative of the people of this country in terms of gender, in terms of men and women? Then no, 40 is definitely not enough. Far from any kind of optimal number. Yeah. And what that means is it translates into two things. You have a lot of tokenism, and then you also have the at least one woman syndrome, because the Constitution of Ghana, I think the crafters were hoping that in saying there should be at least one woman, whether it's on a board or whatever it was, the intent was that the women should be included. What it's become is a curse. So the one woman usually becomes only one woman. You know, and so if you look at the leadership in Parliament, for example, there's one woman on either side, and it's not good enough. You know, if you look at what keeps happening in terms of the institutional memory, the women usually don't make it long enough in Parliament to actually make it to the front bench, even though we have seen first-timers becoming members of leadership. It's not enough. And one of the things that I keep saying with regards to women aspiring to political leadership, aspiring to any kind of public office is, it's those little things. If you have a policy that says women have a specific role that they play in our society in Ghana, for example, so aside from being a working woman, you're expected to be the main nurturer of the children. You are expected to make sure the house is running correctly. So what kind of incentives do we have in place that says that any woman who has so-and-so number of children, any woman who is, or any woman in general, is given a tax incentive or is given an extra allowance on her salary, whatever it may be, to correct that balance? Because there's a lot of unpaid work that women do that is not recognized, that keeps the country going. We need to somehow be able to quantify and monetize it in some way in order to cushion women, because by virtue of that role that you're playing at home, which we can't pretend that it's not happening, by virtue of that role, someone else, if it's a husband, for example, is managing to stay in Parliament for longer. So there are times when we're in Parliament. The last meeting, we were in Parliament till 4 a.m. In my first term, at some point, I had to call it quits and say, listen, I need to go because my children are at home. Parliament does not make provision for that. We don't have childcare facilities in the House of Representatives and Parliament. So sometimes it's the little things that sometimes as a man you may not avert your mind to because there's usually somebody else looking after the children. But these are the realities that we face with as women. The danger we face, though, is when you raise this issue, then the question, the response is usually, well, if it's too hot for you in the kitchen, then, you know, get out of the kitchen.
But what keeps you going?
Well, the fact is, the fight is not going to end today. And if at this point in 2024, we're still dealing with a 14% representation of women in Parliament, we're not there yet. I have 3 daughters. I need to be sure that I'm pushing the boundaries far enough so they don't have to do exactly what I'm having to do to get where they need to get to. And I believe that every woman who is fighting in a space is doing so because she recognizes the fact that what she's doing is laying a foundation for the current and future generations. We're not there yet.
Dr. Lusigi, is this just an isolated case? Because I'm sure one of our viewers would say, well, she's an MP. Maybe that's why she's facing this challenge. From the perspective of UNDP, is this what women in leadership are going through across the world?
I just want to ride on an important point that she has made. It's about having a critical mass of women. And the critical mass is looked at maybe 30% and above, because that is when you will see a shift in workplace culture. That is when you will see some of the issues being picked up and becoming core values. But I must say, as the United Nations, we have placed workplace culture and addressing gender equality in the workplace as a core part of our business operating model. And we are also trying to make sure that we have the capacity to help other institutions to do that. So we definitely advocate to having more women over a certain threshold and having a critical mass of women, and looking at the policies that facilitate that, such as, childcare, for instance, work-life balance, leave policies, and even just creating a workplace that is conducive really helps that to happen.
The question about what women go through, especially in leadership, and I was just picking on the example from Dr. Rollins. What's the position of UNDP on trying to change the norm and the structures? Because we've all come to terms that this is established, and it's not just a case of Ghana. There are other countries also, where you find women in leadership going through the same challenges.
Well, one of the critical things that we're seeing works around the world is definitely creating, looking at your policies. We have a process where we have a gender seal certification, where we look at our policies at the workplace, we look at our practices, and we try to edit that and audit that and see what the challenges are for women in the workplace. And I believe that a culture of introspection and looking what the practices are and aligning that to the goal of equal representation and creating a fair a place for both women and men is liberating for women, and it's liberating for men. Because I can assure you that men are also enjoying some of these leave policies, for instance, family leave policies. So it's creating a better workplace for women also benefits the men, and it benefits society.
I want us to talk about a piece of legislation that has spanned, many parliaments, the sessions. And Dr. Zaneto, you've been fortunate to be part of some of those the lives of those, parliamentary sessions. It's about the affirmative action bill, which you say now is before Parliament. Do you see that passing in the House?
It would be a shame if it didn't, because as a country that likes to talk about how we celebrate women, with a bill of this nature that has been going back and forth for as long as it's been, where it's not just been the women who asked about the bill. Some of the male MPs have also raised issues on it. I think it would be a real indictment on us as a legislative arm of this country to not pass it. However, whatever we do with regards to this bill, we have to make sure that it's implementable. So as it's the nature of trying to gender mainstream and create this equality that we're looking for and equity. Really, it's not just the bill. There are a lot of things that must happen around it. The legal framework in general has to now be gender sensitive, and even looking at the issue of budgets, sector budgets, must all be gender mainstreamed. You see, the danger we face at times, and I keep using the word danger because, we're coming to a point where climate change seems to be overtaking the issue of women, but women are the core of all the things that are going wrong in the sense that they suffer the most, women and children. And yet somehow climate change has become more fashionable, and the issue of women seems to have slightly diminished with respect to where funding is going. And now the tick box, the favorite tick box everywhere is the climate change tick box. And it's almost shining the light slightly away from the reality of women's issues, which we haven't finished addressing. And I don't think we can ever finish. The affirmative action bill has to be implementable, which means that we have to ensure that it is able to do what it needs to do across sectors and across socioeconomic levels and across different scopes of life. Otherwise, we will find ourselves with a lovely law that looks nice on paper, but will not achieve the desired objective. And so it's not a bill that can be taken lightly. It will require a lot of broad stakeholder engagement. We're going to have to really look at it very critically, because what you also don't want to do is tie yourself up into some kind of a legal knot that makes it impossible to be flexible enough to allow yourself to adapt as circumstances change. But I think in addition to the issue of affirmative action, We really need to push for political party reforms. We also need to ensure that as a House, any sector budget that's coming to any committee that's going to be laid before the House must be gender mainstreamed.
We'll look at the political level shortly, but
Yes.
still on the bill, the argument is this is not the first time.
No, it's not.
We've seen that, and many have lost track of where the bill is now. Are you able to provide some updates on that?
No, the bill is actually before the committee, and the idea is once it's dealt with at the committee level, then it comes before plenary, and then there's a broader inclusivity in terms of broader engagement at the consideration level, clause by clause, and all of that. Then you have the debate and all of that. But at the moment, it's before the committee, and a lot of careful analysis and critical, assessment of that has to be done, because the reason why the previous bills did not manage to make it through was exactly because there were issues that could not be resolved. And so it had to be looked at again. And these issues came up when it actually came before the House on one occasion where there was an initial engagement, and they looked at it and it would not have achieved its desired objective. So the hope is that this time it will, because honestly, at this point, we really should be past the talking stage and the doing. The reality of any act is there is a chance to amend. There is a chance to repeal, but you have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that, I believe the president in his first term made reference to this in 2 of his State of the Nation addresses. And I believe that this is basically the last year for us to see this go
if anything
through.
will happen.
Yeah.
And we'll come to the political level and the aspect of political commitment. But Dr. Lusigi, the general argument surrounding policies such as the affirmative action has been about, the 2 great divides, if I should call it that way. Those who say, quota systems are not helpful for women in the first place. And there are some who say, allow the women to fight for themselves. Where do you stand in all of this?
Okay. Let me just start from the fact that
Yeah.
Ghana is punching below its weight. At 14.5% representation in parliament, with less than 28% of the MPs under 45, we really are at a critical stage where something has to give. So affirmative action has worked elsewhere. We've seen it work in countries such as Rwanda, and it is one of the tools that will push us towards a path. So I don't say that it's perfect, but it is a very important tool, and we need to engage it even as we look beyond the affirmative action bill, because we have to look at what's happening with political parties. We also have to look at how do we engage with aspiring young women leaders? How do we create a supportive ecosystem where we address some of the barriers to their engagement? So affirmative action is one. It's not going to be perfect, but let's at least use what we have on the table. It can be perfected as we go along. It will not always be the same tool. So I really think, I'm with the people who say, let's put it on the table, let's work on it, let's get it moving, let's not wait for perfection.
And then you are asked, where's the strength of the woman? Very often that conversation comes up as to women standing up for their own rights and fighting for what they deserve.
But we do have some people who've stood up for their rights, and you can see them in parliament now, right? But if we really are looking at a world where we're taking the best of what we have as a society, and we're looking at both the men and the women in leadership, then clearly removing the barriers for women in leadership means that as a society, we're drawing on our best. So as far as I'm concerned, whether it's fighting or not fighting, we have to recognize that there are significant barriers for women in leadership, whether it comes from the financing side, whether it comes from the stereotypes, whether it comes from the multiple roles that they play in society. So anything that we can do to reduce those barriers so that we can have our best leadership coming forward, whether female or male, I think definitely that's what should be on the table.
Dr. Rollins, you've fought your way through, isn't it?
Still
so
fighting.
You should be on the other side.
We're still fighting. Listen, if we must call a spade, it is not a case of the women asking to be given an unfair advantage. If you have an imbalance and you're demanding for that balance to be restored,
Right.
that's not you asking for a favor. All you're doing is asking for a balance to be restored. There are issues that, by virtue of the role that men play in our society, never come to the awareness of male representatives, whereas these may affect women differently. I believe we've made reference to the issue of funding, and the supportive ecosystem that women need in the political landscape. The reality is that it's a little more vicious than that. There are certain types of abuse that are reserved for women. And I don't think that as a society we're doing enough to actually make it uncomfortable for people who want to abuse women the way we're seeing being done. And I'm sorry, but the fact that you've opted to go for public office is not a reason, it's not a justification for the levels of vicious abuse that women have to go through, whether verbally, whether physically, or whether online. A lot of that happens. And the unfortunate thing about it is when you have so many capable women who have literally fought their way to be wherever they are in life, and they're taking a peek at what's happening to other women who may be professions in their own right, having to endure certain levels of abuse that women in politics have to endure. It does not create an enabling environment. It's not an incentive to have more women, more capable women, aspire to take on those positions, because you're thinking, what are the things I'm going to have to explain to my children? For example, the lies. Why should my image be tarnished by someone who doesn't actually know me, who knows they're lying, but they've decided this is the path they must go on? And I think as a society, really, we must show a little bit more protection of our women. We're not doing enough of that. We're not making If I were to play the role of a conspiracy theorist, I would ask myself, is this a deliberate attempt to keep more women out of the decision-making space? Because we need to, if we're speaking so much about women in leadership, women being an important part of what we do as a nation, the agric sector, the women are carrying that, but they don't own the land, and they don't get majority of the earnings that come from it. The non-formal sector, the women, again. And yet we're not actually, as a country, recognizing the value that women add to us as a nation and really putting our money where our mouth is. And I feel that a lot more has to happen, not just in the political landscape, but across board.
Right. I'm just taking a look at the last district level elections, Dr. Lucy, and possibly giving the examples of Dr. Rawlings. I'm beginning to suspect that that's why we're not seeing more and more women come up to say, well, I want to lead, even at the local level.
Well, that's very interesting, and I know from the last district level elections, a lot of prominence is not given to district level elections, and turnout is usually quite low. We had only 35% turnout to vote. But I really want to congratulate the women who stood. And, the 1,000 women who stood for local assembly positions, and over 5,600 who stood for unit committee positions. We know, representation is still very low. It was 4%, very, very slight increase from the last elections. But actually, 1 in 4 of the women who stood for assembly level positions actually made it. So it actually means that there is interest, and if we can build on that, we can be able to see more fair representation. And the reason why I think that level is very important is because that is very connected to the communities, and what happens at that level affects the livelihoods and the opportunities available at local level. So I really think that although the numbers are low, there is an opportunity to engage more with the women who are already standing. And one of the key things, and in conversation we've had with some women who've stood, is that the economic empowerment side is so important, because they are embedded in the community and they are able to, when they're economically empowered, to be able to now go out there into the political space.
Are there some key issues that we need to be on the lookout for as a country in terms of, tearing down the barriers and allowing more and more of these women to show up, to be more courageous and to move into leadership?
Well, number one, at least recognize that they're there, because the first point of conversation is always that there are no women and they're not standing. They're there, right? So for the ones that are actually standing, we encourage them, and we would also like to create more mentorship opportunities for women who are already in the space to be able to reach out to young upcoming women who are also ready to stand. The financial side is also very important, but it's also implementing the existing policy framework that is actually calling for more gender equality at the local level. So there are existing frameworks. How can we make sure that those are being implemented? So those are some of the kind of supportive things we can look at, the general mentorship, but also the financial side, and making sure that they're able to operate on a level playing field, but also holding institutions accountable for actually implementing the kind of regulations that they've already put in place for equality at the local governance level.
I see. The issue about mentorship, which you pointed out, Dr. Rollins, you've seen so many women come up to you and say, I want to be where you are, or even, surpass your level. But the point is they need someone, to give them that challenge and to try and urge them on to many more leadership roles. What are some of the personal experiences you've had, trying to go into political office?
Well, I suppose there's on the one side, people or young women who I may have, guided or mentored at some point, and then versus on my side, how I had to kind of manage my way through. I think one of the issues we face as women is because so many women, when they're at that point, are struggling to survive, you actually don't have enough space to take on enough young women to mentor, because you're literally trying to fight for your survival. And there isn't any kind of framework, an intentional framework in place that allows for you to formally take on 1, 2, 3, a couple of young women or a group, for example. You have to, within the scope of how you're struggling, try and create space to make that happen. And it can be a bit tricky, because if we are not helping to bring the young women around us and also to lift them up, then that gap remains. And the problem with that is you might have a break in the continuity. If you observed what happened in the primaries for both the NDC and the NPP subsequently, I'm sure you noticed how many current MPs, female MPs, lost in their primaries, and in some cases lost to men, which brings me back to the point of, as a political party, if you are determined to have more women, what kind of a policy or regulations do you have in place with regards to how women get contested at the primaries or during internal elections? And these are very important questions that we must ask ourselves, and we can't run away from.
And sorry for cutting through, you are a member of the NDC.
Yes.
Do you see your political party doing that enough?
Well,
or you need to do more?
A few of the women MPs lost to male candidates,
right,
which is exactly the point I'm making. That's why I named both political parties. And if we're really to make progress, we're going to have to look at this as it is, not through partisan lenses.
Right.
We're really just going to have to face the truth about where we are. We're not doing well enough within the political landscape. And we also have a scenario where not enough women are wanting to enter the party at the various levels, because there is, like Dr. Lissi said, this issue of the monetary aspect of it, where you're automatically expected to take on more responsibilities as a woman. And now if you're getting into politics, you're having to spend money as well, which is almost money that you can budget for it, but it does not make any returns. So money in the political landscape is not money you're investing with returns. Right. So it's money you kind of have to write off, more or less. No, you have to write it off because it's not yielding anything. So when you're talking about women going into that space, how are we providing a cushion? You know, we've had the issue of women paying half the filing fee for a long time, but it hasn't translated into anything more. And we need to go beyond that, which is when you have a legal framework that looks at political party financing, campaign financing, all of these. If we have the proper framework in place, then you can put in the women's aspect to that and say, as part of campaign financing, women are allowed X amount more, or in certain areas. You can then tweak the law to suit your particular circumstance as you're hoping for it to translate into representation ultimately, whether in the House of Parliament or whether the executive. Mentorship is important. If you look back historically, or should I say traditionally, we've always had rites of passage from, you know, being a child into an adult, where you have the men go through their rite of passage, mostly with older men who understand the culture and traditions, and then you have the same with women. Now, as we've progressed, a lot of these rites of passage have been shoved aside. The idea of rites of passage is to bring somebody into that group by letting them understand, by guiding them, teaching them. We're not seeing that in the political landscape. It's not happening with our young women to a large extent. And I think that is a huge piece of what's missing, the mentorship, but mentorship that is tailored, that is intentional.
To the needs of women.
To the needs of women.
But I was just thinking about this, that since we have more men in the space, how about switching roles, having more men to mentor women as well?
To be very honest...
Did you get that yourself?
My father was one of my biggest advocates.
Right.
In terms of how much he pushed me to learn things, to, you know, whether I was learning how to fly or, you know, he was a soldier, so I learned how to, you know, strip and assemble a weapon, like things like that. He pushed me as far as I was able and beyond what I thought I could do. And I never had a scenario where I thought I couldn't do something because I was a female or because I was a girl. And the reason I say this is because in a society, when you're wishing to break that ceiling, to really shatter it completely, you need to have the male advocates. You need to have men who understand the value of lifting women from where they are to where they ought to be, of empowering women.
Right.
So we need those real role models. And I have to just throw this in there because it's a reality that we're faced with. In putting male role models there as mentors for women, we must pay close attention that sexual harassment does not get into that mix, because there's a lot of that happening. Nobody likes to talk about it, but I will talk about it every time because it's real. And you should not have the concern about your daughter being mentored by someone and start wondering what else is going on. That should not be part of your concern. You should have a society that frowns on the levels of sexual harassment and sexual abuse that we're seeing in Ghana, whether it's defilement of students in school or whatever it is. And a society that recognizes the fact that that young lady should be given as much respect as a young man would be given in such a scenario.
Dr. Lusigi, he for she, we all embrace it. In fact, I'm committing to it. But that's another downside to the policy, or you know, the push to have more men mentoring women.
Absolutely. I just want to go in another direction as well. It's good for the mentorship for women, to be specific for women, but I think we also need to mentor men to live in a world which is more equal.
Okay.
Then we have, then we have a society where there's an expectation that, yes, I am going to have women in my space and we are going to be equal and we're going to be able to share this space, as much as it's also providing role models for women who are not used to, being assigned to certain roles to be able to think outside the box. So I really think that we need to look at a society where it's normalized to have women in leadership and men in leadership, and to start that whole conversation from as early as possible, in schools and so on, so that we normalize, having women in leadership.
I want us to talk about, the economics of it, right? Because the data is indicating to us that we could be adding some 20% more plus to our GDP if we empower more women. Do you see that, easily happening for countries, developing nations such as Ghana?
I think it's imperative for countries such as Ghana to think in those directions, because what we're talking about is removing barriers in the workplace so that you have more women in the workplace. It's looking at ensuring that even where women are working, it's more productive. We know that we have a lot of women in the informal space. Yeah. We know even when it comes to trade, when it comes to the informal sector, that's where we find a lot of women. So they're working, but they're not getting paid. Right. So when we start looking at issues around increasing productivity, access to technology, access to business development and so on, then you are creating more productivity in the economy as a whole, and that grows the economy. So definitely we're investing in spaces where women are more represented, and making sure that they can get a fair return on their labor, and that grows the economy.
For Ghana, and being specific about the country because of the unique situation we have, you have more women in the informal space, and then they end up contributing to the development of the economy. Some say they've been with us, they've been in the informal sector. We're not seeing the effects of it. Show us the evidence that indeed if we empower more of the women, then we can improve economically.
Well, actually, I beg to disagree, but the women are there. The fact is that our statistics don't tend to pick up a lot of what's happening in the informal sector. Right. So as we're getting better and better at collecting the information, we actually now begin to see some of their contributions. If we look at just one sector, such as shear processing, for instance, there's a lot of women who are involved in shear processing, but they're using really traditional tools. But if you look at that space and introduce the technology and the machinery and the access to markets that is necessary, then you will see more resources flowing to those women, to those communities and those families. So in a way, we're getting better at pinpointing where the women are. And if we get better at making sure that they have access to the productivity enhancing technologies and financing and markets, then we will be able to actually measure better the contribution that they're making, which is already significant.
Dr. Rollins, the point about women in leadership, I guess we're not just looking at it through the lens of political leadership. There are some of them who are in business, for instance. How do we get, Parliament and, the authorities, the executive, to provide more funding and support to these women?
For one thing, as I mentioned earlier on, we need to just look at how do we create, I don't want to call it a welfare system, but a system in place that says, as a woman, you're given X amount more. Whether it's a social intervention fund for those in the non-formal sector, for example, that says all the women in X location who are involved in, petty trading, for example, teach them how to manage their books, provide them with the traditional susu system, which we know that usually the women are really good at paying back. And when they borrow from banks, they pay back. How do we create a system where when women are seeking loans from banks, and I'm not talking about microfinance, I'm talking about the banks. How are the banks being gender sensitive? And recognizing the fact that a lot of the women who would like to take a loan, for example, to expand on their businesses, are being asked to bring collateral, which they don't have because they don't own the land that they're working on, but they're the ones working the land. They don't own the property, so they can't bring it in as collateral, but they have a business that is thriving, and given the opportunity, they could actually grow the business, and they would do it diligently. And if you look at the success of the women's businesses, I'll give you something, a very simple one. If you're in Accra, you know about this. Okay. The woman who sells Kiliwili at Labone Junction. She's been consistent. Very consistent. Very consistent. So if this woman, for example, decided to create a franchise, for example, if she'd been provided with the funding, would we be seeing, the Labone-style Kiliwili at various points in Accra? And I would be curious to ask how the Cocoa King actually got his support to expand his business, and whether other women who would have liked to do so would be, given those opportunities. And the reason I'm breaking it down to the very basic level is sometimes we're looking so high up the pyramid and we're forgetting that it stands on a base. And the base is not being supported enough. And it's as simple as let's just make sure that as we look at a national budget, how much of what we make in our budget is going to be targeting women specifically. If we are saying that we can't quantify the role, but it's not true. We do know how much women contribute. That's how we can come up with a figure of how many billions would make a difference to women's, if we increase women's empowerment. Yeah. How many more billions we would be making. It means that we do know what the figure is. The Ghana Statistical Service has figures that we can work with. And I believe that this disconnect between what the Statistical Service is doing and whether it's political parties and their manifestos or whether it's governments and their policies, there's a gap that is not taking cognizance of the reality of what we're dealing with. And if we're really to do that, it also takes political will. And literally, you need to be fully aware and wanting to consciously invest in women, invest in ensuring that women can actually rise, can actually do better. Because the reality is when you have a woman successful in any community, the community is elevated.
And some say that's why we need Dr. Zanetto Rawlings as president.
Oh.
Anyway, but we accept that we all can't do that. I'll take your thoughts on that at the end of the show. But that's where, the belief is that Ghana cannot do this alone. We need the likes of the UNDP to support more women. What programs do you have, at the UNDP supporting more women in leadership and in business?
Well, let me start with what we're doing on entrepreneurship, because we believe that this is a space that there's a lot of opportunities now, especially with things like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. There are opportunities now to trade across borders, and we're looking to meet micro, medium, and small-scale enterprises to be the engine that opens up jobs and opportunities for young people and also women-led enterprises. So we're very much looking at the ecosystem as a whole. So we're working with Empretech, ABSA and MasterCard Foundation and others to be able to create a space for identifying young innovators and being able to take them through a process of business development, support, and so on, so that they can be able to grow the kinds of enterprises that will be able to access formal financing. And we're not the only ones doing that. And so we believe strongly that there should be better coordination amongst all the different players, and working with the enterprise agency, working with the export agency, working with the National Coordination Office for AFTA, just to make sure that we have more young people accessing these opportunities from across the country. But for women in leadership, we're very much looking at the local governance level. As we know, exclusion and young people and women feeling excluded from the organs of local governance creates a little bit of a vulnerability to some of the radicalization ideologies that are abound from some of our neighbors. So we strongly believe that working and strengthening the institutions that are working on the ground to be able to open up the space for young people is something that we're very...
UN Women has released a data on this, pointing out that some 342 million women and girls could be in extreme poverty by 2030 if this trend continues. Are you alarmed about this?
Well, the figures, and I really want to write on what Zanetto said, the Ghana Statistical Services is very good at providing a lot of information about what's happening on multidimensional poverty. Because for us, multidimensional poverty looks at disparities when it comes to health, it looks at disparities when it comes to education, access to food and so on. So there is a very large proportion of women and children who are currently in poverty, and it's likely to increase if we don't see a lot of investment in really growing the economy and opening up opportunities for women.
And it brings us back to our point again, Dr. Zanetto, about helping more young women to come out of extreme poverty. Either we're giving them support for their businesses or whichever way we want to do them. How are you contributing personally as a member of parliament towards achieving that?
Well, to start with, when it comes to education, And when it comes to support in terms of social intervention, I'm very particular about supporting women in my constituency. And I always encourage them to actually make it clear that they are actually doing their little businesses. I will say, I just want to say something here just to illustrate sometimes the difficulties that we face in trying to support the most vulnerable. I remember on one occasion making a request from the directorate for intervention, to release funds for some women who were actually just really doing tabletop business, as we call it. And the criteria that we're given were so ridiculous. I actually had to go into a meeting to address it because they were asking for business registration and a business tax identification number. And you're literally only selling a few items on a table to make ends meet. What business registration would you have? We need to be flexible in how we approach things. If you're speaking to a company, that's fair to ask for a business registration, okay? But if you're looking at a woman who is selling, whether it's a few packets of Indomie and some tins of milk, the cost of registering a business will be so much more than the money she's requesting in terms of an intervention to be able to just continue with her trading. And you have to ask yourself, are we trying to elevate the most vulnerable out of poverty, or are we trying to keep them there? Because whatever policies, whatever structures you have in place, they're supposed to ensure, yes, transparency, yes, accountability, and all of those things, but they're also not meant to be exclusionist for those who are most vulnerable. So if you find yourself in a cycle where the various checks and balances you're putting in place are now serving as a way to keep people in poverty, then you're not achieving your objective. And then it means the pillars of good governance are not quite being recognized. So why I'm saying so is that, yes, I do have a very special interest in supporting women. I have an agric program that I've been doing for the last 3 years now.
Right.
And what we've tried to do is we've targeted women, youth, and then persons with disability. And the idea is to look at urban farming or urban agric. So we look at things that are easy you don't need too much technical expertise with. So we've had rabbit training, we've had snails, mushrooms, and now we're teaching people how to make yogurt. Now, what we do with this training is at the end of the training, you give a package, or we've been given a starter pack to those who are engaged in the training. Because the reality is, if a woman is having a crisis at home, she'll reprioritize, and the money that is meant to be for her training goes to whatever the crisis is. However, if the training happens and you give her the rabbits, you give her the cage, you give her the feed to start with, you've given her something to start with.
Right.
Why I'm saying so is because when it comes to the idea of empowerment, the idea of mentorship, it's not literally about just, I've trained you, I've given you something, okay, you're on your way. Yeah. Because most businesses, most people who try to start up businesses within the first or second year may fail without that extra support. So we need to be looking at how do we collaborate. And I always encourage collaboration amongst those we train to make sure that they don't feel isolated, they don't feel alone, that they have the support of the group, they can reach out to one another, they can help each other with expertise, with produce and all of that. And that's something that I have personally taken seriously. In addition to identifying young women as we go around and saying, listen, what's your interest? Let's see, the Design Technology Institute, for example, where it's a very, very good TVET. I think they have a lot of support from the MasterCard Foundation. I had to also support these, a lot of young women and some young men from my constituency.
And I believe these
training.
are things that you're doing, a reason for which your constituency, they'll give you another term, at least from within your political party. Do you feel that you would want to, at some point, scale it up? You've been MP for, I think, 3 terms now?
No, I'm just finishing my second term now.
So you're going into the third, hopefully, if you get to win. Do you feel Ghanaians will want to see you do more, at least become president of this republic?
Maybe you should do a survey and let's find out. Because I'm not quite sure I can sit here and jump to that conclusion. But what
Have you thought about it?
Well, I think that it's difficult not to think about what one might do differently when one sees the frustrations and the challenges that we face as a country, whether it's in the space of corruption or whether it's in the space of better road network or supply of healthcare and all of that. So, yes, it's something that I think one is forced to look at and think about. And with regards to what the future holds, I think that we will have to see. But it's also, I think I'll go back to what Anla said about the critical mass. You know, I believe that when it comes to the issue of leadership, Ghanaians beyond a woman are also looking for a certain level of integrity. I think politics has become so badly tarnished that people recognize when people are being genuine, when people are being sincere, and when people are fighting for the truth. I would like to believe that I have so far represented my people with integrity and with the level of commitment that I was expected to, and hopefully more. Should that time come, I mean, maybe you do the survey.
And that's the politician in you.
Well,
one more time. Let me reframe this. You've been, the closest to
putting me on the spot. I see.
You've been the closest to one of Ghana's longest, serving heads of state. Have you ever spoken to your dad about, the fact that in the history of this country, no woman has been given the opportunity to lead this country, and that you would want to change something?
Oh my goodness, you are refusing to let this question go. I thought you said we'd chat about it after the interview.
I know,
well, he's not alive to defend himself, so I don't know whether to put it on him instead. I suppose he has raised the question on would we do it differently if we had a woman, at the helm of affairs. And he certainly was an advocate in terms of pushing women as far as they were willing to go and beyond, because sometimes your own limitations actually stop you, and his extra push would be the thing. So he would have raised the issue. We would have discussed not just that, but in general, issues to do with Ghana, because Ghana was very dear to his heart. I think the whole continent actually. Yeah, I think maybe we wait and see.
Okay.
We wait and see.
Let me get out of family business. And Dr. Lucy, we know, this is the point where we should stop complaining about the challenges and then get to the action part, solving the problems. And this is the point at which women are being invited, right, to also drive change through innovation. Science, technology has been a space dominated largely by men. And again, we still have just a few more women, like Dr. Rollins, also, coming into that space. How is the UNDP helping, young girls and other people to come into the STEM space, knowing that this has long been dominated by men?
Well, actually, you've talked about opportunities for solutions. And I think the innovation space is alive and well in Ghana. And we see both men and women in that space. So one of the things that we're doing in partnership with MasterCard Foundation is we're trying to see how we can identify innovators wherever they are. So we have a program called Young Africa Innovates, and the idea is that we want to go and find these innovators wherever they are. And we don't want to have barriers such as language, level of education, location, preventing them from being able to step up into this space. So we're very much looking at how we can create a pipeline of innovative ideas and people who can be able to access the opportunities that are available to develop their talent, to get financing, to grow the kinds of businesses that we can attract, that can attract big investment. So the idea here is that why don't we open up the space? Why don't we demystify the whole way of being able to access resources and access the programs that we currently have. Mastercard Foundation has some of those programs, and we also have, enterprises and outfits in Ghana that are already providing these kinds of services, but they're not able to access. So whether you're a person living with disabilities, whether you're a person living in an area where there's no internet, we want to be able to create that environment where you can be able to access those opportunities. And in that way, I think we can be able to identify not just young men, but also young women. We can also be able to identify people who are facing other barriers, such as language, disability, to be able to access that space. So I think looking into the future, having more opportunities like that will open up the space for having more young women being represented. But I also think that we need to look at the education space as well, and look at the opportunities that we have with digitalization. And to be able to make sure that we don't repeat the challenges that we've had in the past, where we only have access to maybe people living in urban areas, to being able to really look at how we can galvanize the education space through digitalization to open up the opportunities to be able to access
Are there more
information.
partnerships in the offing, at least working with other organizations to achieve?
Oh, there are a lot of organizations already active, and we're really looking at how we can create the platform where we can engage with a number of organizations to do that.
Since we're doing this in the honor of women and as part of the International Women's Day, let me take your final comments on this, Dr. Honest.
Thank you. What I would like to say is we really need to push for this affirmative action that will not just be political, but all of sector, all of society. We need to ensure in Parliament specifically that we have gender-responsive budgets. We need to pay attention to the unpaid work that women do, and we need to do it as a matter of urgency because we saw that the effect of the COVID pandemic left women a lot worse off, relatively speaking, proportionally in terms of what they suffered, their greater vulnerabilities. And I think that women's issues need to be put to the forefront. We need male advocates who understand the value of creating a more balanced society. And certainly we need to look at getting a lot more women in leadership because women have a different way. We've seen how a lot of countries that were led by women had a better approach in terms of how they handled their populations during the COVID pandemic. And we've seen how a lot more women's issues, a lot of more societal issues are addressed when you have women at the decision-making table. And I believe the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 really makes a case for the role of women in a central, not just in terms of post-conflict building and reconstruction, but really the decision-making process in terms of how a society progresses.